Hi, I'm Dr. Steve Klien from the Department of Communication at the University of Missouri. This is the latest in a series of online video lessons intended to provide you important principles and helpful concepts for the study of communication. In this video, we're going to take an introductory look at mediated communication. Now, when we think about media, the vast array of different kinds of technologies that can bring audiences messages instantaneously all over the world, and the complicated ways in which they can influence and have effects on audiences, obviously, one video is not going to be able to do the subject justice. And so that's not what this video is about. We're going to do something a bit more focused. I want to try to establish a definition of mediated communication and contrast it against the perhaps more popular term of mass communication so that we can have an understanding of how the two concepts are certainly related but are different in a really important way. We'll take an overall big picture look at the evolution of mass media over the centuries so that we can get a sense of the different types of ways that media could potentially intersect with audiences and have different kinds of experiences with messages. And finally, we'll take a brief look at some of the different functions that mediated communication can serve producers and especially receivers of messages. So let's start with a simple definition. Mediated communication is communication that relies on a technology as the channel to transmit messages between sources and receivers. In previous videos in this series, we took a look at some basic models of communication. And in those models, a channel is essentially whatever the conduit is between the source and the receiver of the message, how a message gets transmitted from point A to point B. So when we're talking about mediated communication, the channel that's being used to get that message from point A to point B involves some kind of technology. And as we'll talk about later in this video, the kinds of technology that can function as a medium are many and varied. Now, when we think about mediated communication, one of the things that most of us think about most of the time is mass communication. But mass communication as a concept is something that's a bit more specific. According to Littlejohn and Foss, mass communication is the process whereby media organizations produce and transmit messages to large publics, and the process by which those messages are sought, used, understood, and influenced by audiences. Now, in this definition, the key thing that you need to key in on is this idea of large publics. The notion of the mass public is an idea that starts developing in the early part of the 20th century. Although, as we'll see in our history of mass media, the implications of mass communication obviously predate that. The notion is that we're talking about a message that's sent by a group or an organization to a very large group of people all at the same time. A mass public is essentially something that we think about in terms of hundreds, thousands, even millions of people. That's what we mean by mass communication, when the same message is sent to lots and lots of people all at the same time. Mediated communication, of course, includes mass communication, but isn't limited to just that. It involves any kind of communication that utilizes a technology as a channel, including point-to-point and narrowcasted messages that are aimed at just a few people, or maybe just from one person to another person. So with an understanding that mediated communication involves specific media technologies and approaches to sharing messages between folks that don't just involve mass communication, a really good way to get into this subject matter is to think about mass media and specifically the ways in which mass media technologies have evolved over the centuries. Now, clearly, we're going to be taking a pretty high elevation look at this, and there's lots of really important historical details that this video just simply can't get into for time and resource constraints. But what I want you to think about as you consider the ways in which media have evolved over the centuries are the ways in which changing technology can change some really important things in the communication process. Changes in media technology can change how many people and who can actually go about producing messages, as well as how many people and who can receive those messages. Changing technology also influences how quickly messages can be communicated and get from the sources to the receivers, as well as how expensively or inexpensively those messages can be communicated. Depending on the speed and the expense of media communication, we can have thousands to millions of people communicated very easily with very simple access to all of them, whereas in other situations we could be reaching relatively fewer people at a higher cost, which means that some people might be actually left out of the receiving process. And finally, changing technology is going to change how receivers are able to interact with the messages. The kind of media technology that gets used is going to influence what kind of information is going to be included in a message, what form it's going to take, and so subsequently it's going to inform the way that audiences actually think about and experience, even emotionally experience, as well as interact with and experience messages in terms of their senses. When we think of mass communication and mass media, we tend to think of contemporary technologies. But it's important to remember as we start thinking about mass communication starting with the age of the manuscript, that mass media is actually centuries, if not millennia old. As soon as civilizations discovered that they needed to somehow transmit enduring versions of messages over long distances, that they weren't going to be able to rely on an oral tradition anymore. So writing as a technology for communication became increasingly important. And as certain kinds of texts, particularly things like religious and spiritual texts such as the Bible and the Quran, as well as other forms of texts related to scientific and philosophical study, as these books started becoming more important, it was going to be necessary for them to be produced and reproduced. Now, in the age of the manuscript, which really comes up to the forefront in the medieval period, it's important to remember that these texts are written and transcribed and copied by hand. And so access to books and other forms of written communication is going to be really time-consuming to create and really expensive to produce and to acquire, which means that education in order to become literate, to read and write, was something that was really only going to be useful for certain sectors of society. Certainly those in religious hierarchies in the Western medieval tradition, for instance, those that were primarily responsible for producing books like copies of Bibles, and those that were going to be in the service of those in charge of the upper classes. So we're not even necessarily talking about the kings and queens as much as the advisors of kings and queens that we're going to need to have access to this stuff. So most people, most of the time, really didn't have access to books and subsequently weren't provided the education that was necessary for literacy. That's going to change, of course, in 1450 when Johannes Gutenberg creates the printing press and ushers in the print age. So while it's not going to be something that gets us immediately to universal literacy or anything like that, once it becomes possible to not only mass produce books in a form that is much faster and much less expensive, but it's also possible to produce things such as newspapers and pamphlets and other forms of written text in a way that is much more efficient than it was when you had monks in a cloister copying these things with pen and ink, then it's going to become much more important for more people to develop educations in order to have the skills to read and write, because they're going to be able to have access to things. More folks having access to the Bible, for instance, made the entire Protestant Reformation possible, which basically exploded Christianity into a very different kind of cultural moment. And of course, more access to texts and more education means that the Dark Ages give way to the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, as education and culture, the development of science as well as philosophy, develops in ways that just explode when more people have more access to information through books and other materials. Now, we still haven't gotten to the real explosive potential of mass media yet until we move forward to the 19th century and the development of machine-generated mass producing of published texts. This is where we get into newspapers becoming something that is literally accessible to anyone. The penny press is a phrase that actually gets coined in the early 1830s as newspapers start to realize that they can publish papers in mass quantities very inexpensively. And if you charge just 1 penny for someone to buy a newspaper, this means that they can sell a heck of a lot more. So news and information becomes accessible to everybody. And moving through the 19th century, not just, of course, through newspapers, but other forms of printed material as well, becoming much less expensive and much easier to mass produce. You have the situation where entire populations of nations are able to share the same information from coast to coast. And this is something that really transforms the way that we think about the social and cultural importance of information. Now, around the same time, we have the development of the telegraph. And so being able to send messages through wires via the growing power of electricity means that those penny presses are going to be able to have information from one side of the country being transmitted to the other side of the country reasonably instantaneously, which means that newspapers are going to be able to communicate truly national news. And through the period of the 1900s, where wired telegraphs start giving way to wireless telegraphs in the earliest form of radio, we have the possibility of information being transmitted not just across a continent, but indeed between continents, as we have telegraphy possible across the oceans, literally. Now, once we get into the second decade of the 20th century, radio technology starts becoming a thing. And with the first commercial licenses for radio stations being developed in the United States in the 1920s, what you have is a very different experience for how we get information. So instead of just reading it in a very linear form, left to right, top to bottom, a medium that is much more driven by the transmission of information, radio provides something that is very different. It's something that involves the sense of hearing. It involves human voices as well as other kinds of sounds, including music. So radio develops in such a way that not only makes information possible to be transmitted instantaneously across great distances, but it also makes it a more intimate sensory experience. And as radio develops commercially, it's not just being used for news and information, but it's also starting to be used for entertainment. You have the phenomenon of family and friends getting together within their living rooms to listen to the radio for a variety of reasons, not just getting the news of the day. It also transforms politics as presidents like Woodrow Wilson start delivering the State of the Union address over radio, so for the first time the entire nation can hear it, to the groundbreaking use of radio by presidents like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who during the Great Depression and the Second World War were able to bring the nation together emotionally and motivationally through the power of the fireside chats that it literally sounded like the President of the United States was having a conversation with you in your very own living room. And that's pretty huge. Now, while radio introduces the sense of hearing to understanding information through mass media, we also have, at the same time, the development of motion picture technologies, getting started at the turn of the 20th century and really rolling in the early decades of the 20th century. Starting with silent motion pictures, we have not only visual stimuli as a source of information, but with motion pictures, you not only had pictures, but you also had movement. You had the verisimilitude of seeing something, quote unquote, actually happening on the screen. And then, of course, when Al Jolson, starring in The Jazz Singer, brought talking and music in real time along with the images in motion pictures, well, that just blew the roof off the place. So people were able to get together in large spaces, in towns and across the nation, and have communal experiences, not just through news in the form of newsreels and motion pictures, but of course a booming entertainment industry where entire cultural traditions are being developed and redeveloped through the use of motion picture technology. By the time we start getting into the middle part of the 20th century, broadcast television is going to bring the power of radio and the power of motion pictures into living rooms. Television starts getting developed as a technology in the 1930s, but commercial television stations in the United States start getting licensed in the 1940s, and by the time we get into the 1950s to the 1960s, what's often referred to as the golden age of television, we have a phenomenon where people across the country are getting together separately in their living rooms, of course, to experience, again, not only news, but all forms of entertainment media as well. And so, again, we have this sense of a developing culture and a developing sense of shared social experiences across wide distances. Television also makes these experiences that much more intimate. If you imagine the difference between seeing pictures and sound on an epic scale in a movie theater, and then translate that into the much more conversational and the much more close-up face focus, if you will, of the kinds of communication you get on television, it really transforms everything from entertainment to politics in something that is much more personal and feels almost much more interactive for the viewer in their living room. Now, once we get into the 1970s, the limitations of broadcast television will be exploded by cable and satellite television. So instead of having 3 to 4 to 5 options for television that's available to you, and you can only watch whatever's on, cable and satellite television make it possible for the number of options in television viewing to absolutely explode, and to have the possibility of ultimately having some forms of television media available for you on demand. Which means that consumers of television across nations, across the world, are going to not only be able to experience things in common with thousands or millions of people, but they're also going to start to have the opportunity to be very selective consumers about the kind of information and the kind of entertainment that they want to consume, which is going to actually and ironically start dividing the mass audience. Once ultimately we start developing multiple forms of news networks through cable television, for instance, it's not just that we've got CBS, NBC, and ABC providing the same mainstream television news to everybody in the United States. Instead, we start the development of more niche markets for news. The development of the Fox News channel, for instance, and then some years later, the development of MSNBC actually starts developing news stations that are catering to specific audiences with specific preferences for their news. And that's really going to fundamentally transform the way we think about news and information, let alone entertainment. And then, of course, once we get into the 1990s and moving into the 21st century, the digital information culture and economy explodes with the development of the internet. Now we have a situation where not only do we have access to any kind of information and entertainment around the world, but we also have some very interesting things going on. We have an explosion of different kinds of people, groups, and organizations being able to provide content. So it's not just going to be some certain technologically advanced corporations and other organizations that have access to media technology being able to create content for people. Literally, anybody can be a journalist. Anybody can produce entertainment media that can be disseminated through the internet. And so we have this very interesting dynamic where we still have the power of entertainment and news media being concentrated into the hands of a smaller group of larger, more powerful corporations. At the same time, we also have the capacity for anybody to provide alternatives and counterweight to that mainstream dominant media focus. So this just gives you, again, a thumbnail sketch of, as we've evolved through mass media throughout the centuries, how the ways in which we have access to information and how we actually experience and interact with that information, as well as the other things that aren't necessarily just information, right, are coming to us over the channel of media technology. So as we wrap up this video, we can start thinking about the various functions of mediated communication. And really, we can see that the nature of the medium itself is going to influence the way that we're going to experience these various functions. We use mediated communication for information in order to find out what's going on, to gain knowledge about the world around us. But we also use mediated communication for interpretation. Content providers, everywhere from those who provide news services for us to those who tell us stories for entertainment media, end up not just giving us information, but providing us resources for actually interpreting our reality. And indeed, and something that has become really important at the turn of the 21st century, the use of mediated communication for instruction. Not just transmitting and disseminating information from one point to the next, but actually getting involved in the process of teaching and inculcating knowledge. When we think about mediated communication socially and culturally, it's important to note that we use mediated communication for a bonding function as well. Literally everyone from families to communities to larger social structures and cultures can come together and develop a sense of shared identity and shared experiences through the experiences that they've shared in consuming mediated communication. And then, of course, there's the final function of diversion. We don't just use mediated communication to become informed, but we also use it to entertain ourselves as a recreational activity, to provide some distraction from the other things in our world. So as you can see, mediated communication is going to have a lot of different functions for us, and different forms of media are going to be able to perform those functions in different ways. All of these various functions of mediated communication, however, are going to be influenced significantly by one overarching function, and that's what we refer to as gatekeeping. Gatekeeping essentially means this: media sources select and control what information audiences receive, as well as where they receive it, when they receive it, and how they receive it. If we recall that what media essentially are different technologies that are utilized as channels for communication, that is, the conduit that gets the information and other kinds of things that are going to be communicated from point A to point B, then whoever it is that selects what that conduit is going to be and what sort of messages are going to be put through that conduit are going to have a pretty profound effect on the audience experience. Unlike the kinds of experiences that we all have directly as we go about our lives and we see things and hear things and experience them firsthand, anything that we experience through mediated communication is going to be something that is under the control of whoever it is that's constructing the message and sending it to us. So news isn't news unless those who provide us the news tell us that it's news. The kinds of things that we as a society or a culture might find entertaining or important are really going to be constrained to some extent by those who are providing us those entertaining and important, significant messages in the first place. So it's not a reality that we experience directly. It's a reality that is curated, if you will, by those who are providing the communication. Some messages with some information taking some forms are going to find their way through the gate to us, and others are going to be kept on the outside of the gate and we'll never experience them. So the individuals, the groups, the organizations, and the institutions who do this gatekeeping exert social and cultural power. And that's going to be something that's important, especially when we get to theories like representation theory, where much of what we learn about the world and the people within it are things that we learn through mediated communication. The information and ideas that come through the gate can really have a powerful impact on our lives, and a powerful impact on the lives of those that we encounter and we interpret and judge and react to in certain ways based on the information and ideas that we get through the media gateway. And that about wraps it up. This concludes our introduction to mediated communication. In some subsequent videos in the series, we're going to take a closer look at some specific theories of media effects and influences to see how some of the broader concepts that we discussed in this video might play out under more specific particular circumstances. Until then, if you've got any questions about the content of this video or any of the videos in the series, please don't hesitate to reach out. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.